And welcome back, boys and girls, to another series of I Didn't Know That About Wyoming with Story Time with Mr. Dennis and
Uh,
Aubrey. How you doing, Aubrey?
Good.
Good. We're glad to be with you today. We're going to be talking about a story of a family, a husband and wife, who are making a trip to Yellowstone National Park. Before Yellowstone National Park was a park. Have you ever been to Yellowstone National Park? Maybe when you were really small and you don't remember?
Probably when I was a long time ago.
Probably a long time ago. Well, of course, here in Wyoming, we love Yellowstone National Park. But you may not know of this story that occurred in Yellowstone National Park in 1863. In 1863, Mr. Cowan and his family were traveling by wagon train into Yellowstone National Park. As they were traveling along and everything was going well, all of a sudden, a group of Indians came riding around and surrounded their wagons. Now, Mr. Cowan, he was kind of scared along with his wife. And the Indians, he didn't know that the only thing they wanted, they were hungry and they wanted some food. And they were hoping that Mr. Cowan would share some food with them. But unfortunately, Mr. Cowan, because he was afraid, guess what he did?
What?
He reached for his rifle, and as he reached for his rifle, one of the Indians shot him right in the head. And Mr. Cowan fell to the ground off the wagon, and then they took his wife and they rode off, leaving Mr. Cowan there alone.
Why did the Indians take the wife?
Well, I think that they were hoping that maybe she could help them find some food. But Mr. Cowan, out of a miraculous miracle, didn't die. The bullet had only grazed his forehead and knocked him out for a while, and Mr. Cowan actually was still alive. But what Mr. Cowan didn't know is that the Indians had left one of the warriors up in the hills to make sure that Mr. Cowan didn't go and survive and go back and report to the army that they were there. And so when Mr. Cowan got up to leave, the Indian that was on the hill shot him again right in the back. But guess what?
He was still alive.
He was still alive. Mr. Cowan was only wounded. But he knew that he better not get up again because that Native American was up there waiting for him. So he sat there all night long waiting. And finally, after a while, he tried to get up and he checked to make sure that nobody was watching and he felt safe. So he slowly crawled back to the wagon, and when he got back to the wagon, guess what?
What?
His dog that was with him didn't recognize him because Mr. Cowan was so torn with, his clothes were torn, his face was dirty, and he had blood running down his face, and his dog, thinking he was a stranger, attacked him and started fighting him. And Mr. Cowan had to fight off his dog and finally get him calmed down, but he didn't die. He survived, and he went and he sat and he made a fire for the night. And he got a little bit of food that was left over from the Indians, and he made himself a meal, and he was so tired that he told his dog to watch for things, and he was going to take a nap. Guess what?
What?
He fell asleep, and as he fell asleep, the wind came along, blew the embers of the fire into some of the dry prairie grass, And guess what happened to the grass?
It
Started on
fire.
started on fire. Yeah. And pretty soon his dog was tugging at him, pulling him, and he didn't know what was going on. And Mr. Cowan woke up and he looked and he saw that he and his dog were surrounded by this huge fire. But guess what?
He survived.
He survived, that's right. He and his dog made it through the fire. He got burnt just a little bit more, but they made it through the fire. And luckily, the next day, some soldiers came. And they were on their way to Bozeman, Montana. And so they said that they would take him the rest of the way through the park and take him up to Bozeman, Montana, where there was a hospital, and that they would take care of him. Do you have any questions yet?
No.
Okay. Well, so they loaded him up in a wagon, and they started up through the path through Yellowstone. And in Yellowstone, there's a place called the Grand Canyon of Yellowstone. You know that
Have I
place?
been there?
You've been there when you were really little.
Yeah.
But it is really a deep, deep canyon of lots of rocks that go way down. Well, as the wagon that Mr. Cowan was in was going along the road, something caused the wagon to tip, and the wagon that Mr. Cowan was in tumbled all the way down deep into the gorge.
He didn't die?
He didn't die. Somehow he miraculously survived. And so the soldiers went down, got him, put him back into another wagon, and took him all the way to Bozeman, Montana, into the hospital. Well, once they had him in Bozeman, Montana, in the hospital, and he was starting to feel pretty good, then they notified his wife, who was back east, that her husband was still alive. Can you believe that?
Yeah, but what happened to the husband?
Well,
The wife, I meant.
the wife, well, what happened was that the Indians, after they took her, let her go.
Why did they let her go?
Because they didn't want to hurt her. They were just hoping for some food. And so once they got the food, they let her go, and she was able to find help and make it back home during this time that Mr. Cowan was going through all these experiences. So she was so excited when she heard that her husband was alive. She got on a train. They came out here to the west. She got a wagon that took her up to Bozeman. And when she walked into the hospital, she was so excited to see her husband, and he was so excited to see her, that she ran over and jumped on the bed to give him a kiss. And the bed that was made out of large lodge poles collapsed and fell right on Mr. Cowan.
Did he die?
He didn't die. He survived.
Did he get hurt?
Nope. And eventually, he and his wife were able to leave Bozeman. They went back home. And then in 1892, when Yellowstone National Park became a national park, then they took another trip and went back as a husband and wife to visit Yellowstone. And this time they had a wonderful time. No accidents, no incidents, and they remembered the experience that he had had before. Now, your question, and the question of the boys and girls out there is, Mr. Dennis, how do you know about that story?
And how do you know?
Well, that is a very good question. And we know about this story because Mrs. Cowan, when she got home to St. Louis, contacted a local newspaper and had them write the story as Mr. Cowan and Mrs. Cowan retold it. And Mr. Dennis came across this story in a newspaper that I found that was an old newspaper that someone had kept as a scrapbook. And I actually found that story in that scrapbook. So, I hope you enjoyed that story. And it just goes to show that even when the worst happens, we can always survive. Thank you. And we'll see you next time with I Didn't Know That About Wyoming and story time with Mr. Dennis and
Aubrey.
Aubrey. Say goodbye.
Bye.
See you later.